All right, so here's some stuff we need to talk about. First of all, getting closer to the end of class, I sent an announcement to you guys, which I trust that you read those things. If you don't, there's not much I can do except send them. I can't read them to you, but people are asking about grades and how they're figured. And I'm going to always refer you to your syllabus because that's the reason we write the syllabus, to go over the policies of the class. And that way you don't have to ask every week about what's due, when it's due, how we figure grades, that sort of thing. So see if I can find the syllabus. We'll start with that. There it is. For you, it's going to be in your, well, there's a little section that says syllabus. So that's where I would look if I were you. Syllabus has most of the details that you need. This one, I don't know if this is your class or not, but all of the syllabi have the same thing. So let's look at the section that says grading system. So if you want to know how to figure your grades, I would go to the section that says grading system. It's going to remind you that your assignments are available on Blackboard, that you have due dates on the calendar, which is part of the syllabus, and that each unit has weekly questions, one per chapter, and then a multiple choice or short answer question section that's worth 40 points. So each unit is worth either 70 or 80 points. Your total available points is 300 points. So if you get 270 and you write a book review, then you get an A. You get 270, but you don't write a book review, you get a B, okay? You have to write the book review to get an A. And some of you are going like, well, you never talked about the book review. Where do I find information about the book review? You didn't tell us about the book review. You know it's in the syllabus. You know it is. So just hang on one second. 240 to 269 is a B. 210 to 239 is a C. 180 to 209 is a D. And that's not a very useful grade. So you guys want 210 or above, which is 70% of the available points. The book review is an extra 20 points, so that's in addition to the 300 available points. You cannot get an A without a book review. That's in the syllabus at least 3 times. I tell you that a lot. So late grades, 2 late assignments. By that I don't mean, 2 sections of the weekly questions. So if you've been turning in everything late, you need to cut that out because I don't have to accept it. And I can penalize your grade, that sort of thing. So for those of you, because there's some of you that just turned in work that was due in the middle of October. No, that needs to stop. You can't be that late. Now I realize it does not say in the syllabus how late you can be, but it also says in there, inform me that your work will be late if possible. Several of you who turned in stuff 3 weeks late didn't mention a word about why it was late. So it doesn't make me look very kindly upon your work, and it also makes it much less likely that I'll accept it in the future because, 2 late assignments, you didn't tell me why it was late. Also, that last assignment, you have 2 days, 3 days max, from the due date to the day my grades are due. You need to turn it in time for me to grade it. So the late work really needs to stop after this week, okay? So that last assignment you got to do on time. Book review for an A, you'll either get a passing grade or failing grade on that. And a passing grade could be anywhere from 1 to 20 points. The book reviews are due on a Monday, November 30th. It's the Monday right after Thanksgiving. If you continue to look at the syllabus, it will explain to you what to do with the book review. It is possible that if you submit a book review and you didn't ask me about the book ahead of time and it's not on my list, then I don't have to take it, okay? So make sure that if you plan to do a book review and it's not from a book on the list, that you get permission ahead of time. If you haven't picked a book yet, now would be a good time because it's due in a couple weeks, okay? So if you scroll to the end or the middle, here we are, the middle, this gives you all of the assignments and the due dates. And you notice that even though these questions are weekly questions, we've been over this several times, they are not all due, one at a time. You can turn them all in at a certain time. Okay, so you have 4 due on Friday. You also have your quiz due on Friday, and then the book review is due on the 30th, and then your last weekly questions are due on the 11th of December. This reminds you how much each unit is worth. Again, 10 points for each weekly question, 40 points for the quiz. So 70, 80, 80, 70, and then the 20 extra points for the book review. All right, here's all the stuff about the book review. I don't want to spend too much time on it because we've been over it before. There's a separate video about it on the YouTube page, which I believe I sent you the link to. However, the book review needs to be 4 to 5 pages long. It can absolutely, positively not have any elements of plagiarism in it. So don't copy and paste anything. A sentence, a paragraph, I don't care that the thing's 4 or 5 pages long. If you copy a paragraph from a source and stick it in there, that's not going to be okay. You have to make sure that your work is your own. I know that I mentioned this before, but there were particular issues with plagiarism on some of the weekly questions from the last unit, especially the ones about the New Deal agencies, where it was very clear that people just copy and paste, or would copy and paste from online sources. Cut that out. It needs to be in your own words, okay? I've been as gracious as I can be about that, but you have to stop. All right, so in the book review, do exactly what I ask you to do. 1,500 words, give or take, which is going to be 4 or 5 pages. Please be sure to put your word count. And beginning, I don't care. Just put the word count in your paper somewhere. And the first section should be about a page long. So part 1 should be about a page long. And that's where you go over what the book is about. Part 2 should be 2 pages long. It's where you tell me the author's thesis, if the author proved the thesis, and you use quotes from the book to establish that you believe that she proved their thesis or did not. You need to make sure that your quotes are not all from the same page. So if you quote the book 5 times from page 20, once from page 250, and that's it, I'm not going to think you read the book. I'm going to think that you read page 20 and you read page 250 and you didn't read anything in the middle. Okay, so make sure that you have quotes throughout the book that give me some clue that you read the whole book and that you found evidence throughout the book that the author proved his thesis. If you're wondering what the author's thesis is, be sure to read the foreword or introduction. The author will typically tell you the purpose of the book or the thesis of the book in that introduction, okay? And then part 3 is your evaluation of the book, where you should not say things like, it was boring, it was too long, it wasn't well written. Don't say stuff like that, even if you think that. You need to say something a little more academic in your assessment of the book. So if you think it was boring, tell me what you think the author could have left out or what you would have preferred the author put in. If you think it wasn't well written, tell me what about the book bothered you. Was vocabulary a little too scholarly? Just, be honest about that. But I had a student tell me that they thought a book was very poorly written, and it was a book that got a Pulitzer Prize. So somebody disagreed with them. So you just saying it's poorly written isn't very helpful. Boring, not very helpful. Tell me stuff that they could have left out, stuff they should have put in. How does it compare to things you already know about the subject? How does it compare to what your textbook says about the subject? Now, don't just tell me the textbook doesn't talk about my subject. Almost always, the textbook will talk about something related to your subject. So even if it's not directly about your subject, your textbook is going to talk about the era of your subject or the setting of your subject or the events surrounding your subject. So talk about those things. If you're looking for author's bias, you probably need to know something about the author. So you may want to look up the author online. and see what their background is. You may or may not notice bias, and that's fine if you don't. But I would not say that the author is not biased. I would say you didn't notice a bias, because truthfully, everyone is biased. But you say that however you like, but I'm just telling you ahead of time, for you to say the author has no bias, that's probably impossible. But you can say you did not notice a bias from the author. Did you enjoy reading the book? Would you recommend it to other people? Why or why not? So again, section 1 about a page, section 2 about 2 pages, where I assume you will quote from the book with some regularity, but not super long quotes, but several short quotes throughout the entirety of the book. So not all from the beginning, not all from the end. And then part 3 is where you tell me what you thought. You can also quote in that section as well. You will definitely quote from the textbook. Now, as far as what sort of style, do you use MLA or Chicago Manuals of Style or Turabian or whatever, all I really want you to do is to put a page number. So my assumption will be in parts 1 and 2, when you talk about the book, you just put a page number in there. I know it's the book that you're reviewing. In part 3, when you say in the textbook it says this, and then you put a page number, I will assume that is the page number from the textbook. If you want to do a more formal documentation style, that's fine. I don't care. I will also say to you, just so you will know, when you take an advanced history course, they do not use MLA. They use Chicago Manual of Style or Turabian. It's a slightly different style, but you probably do all of that online with the program anyway. So you just choose a different program when you do that. For me, for this thing, I don't care. Also, I didn't mention this, but in part 1 of the book review, please say the name of the book. Don't just start off with, I read this book. Tell me the name of the book and the author in the first paragraph. It just makes sense, okay? Then grading, I'll either say yes or no, accepted or not accepted. You'll know it's accepted if you get any points at all. If I won't accept it, I will give you a 0. And if you get a 0, we probably will have some other talk as well, and it will be about plagiarism. It will be about plagiarism. Now, if I give you a 0, I will also send you a link, and I will say, this is where I believe you took your paper from, or you plagiarized part of your book from. Now, I have had students tell me in the past, that's not where I got this information, but it was word for word the same. I don't care if that's not where you got it. If it's word for word the same, you got it from somewhere and it wasn't your own mind, okay? So if it's exactly the same, it doesn't matter if that's the site you plagiarized it from or you plagiarized it from another site. Don't do that, okay? Just don't, because then not only do I have to give you an F for the book review, I have to give you an F for the class, the whole class. So don't do it. The reason I'm saying this is every year, at least one person per class does it. It's like, I'm going to notice. You should not sound like a professional historian. You really should not. You should sound like a first-year college student writing about a history book. That's what you should sound like, okay? All right. There's a list of books here. If you want to choose from that list, you don't have to ask permission. You choose from something other than this list, please let me know so that we can be on the same page and we'll agree on things, okay? If you need to do a book review because your point total looks really bad or you'd like to have an A and you haven't picked a book, I would suggest, I'll highlight 3 that I would suggest, mostly because they're short and you're running out of time. So maybe that one, maybe this one. Oops, I guess I'm not technically highlighting. Let me try. So Black Like Me, Gerda Weissman Klein, All But My Life, Ghost of Manila, and Home Before Morning. These are all short enough that I think you could read them reasonably well in the next few weeks and write a decent review. Black Like Me, I know I've talked about these before, and you can always look at the video, but on YouTube. But Black Like Me is the white reporter who goes undercover as a black man in the 60s to write about how African Americans are treated kind of behind the scenes by white people. I realized there are other ways you could get this information and that this book is problematic in a lot of ways, but that gives you more stuff to talk about. So it's not the end of the world. And you, of course, don't have to choose that. Gerda Weissman Klein was rescued from concentration camp, and she ends up marrying the American soldier who she first met. And it talks about her life and their life together. The Ghost of Manila is the Ali Frazier fights. There's a series of 3 of those in the 60s and 70s, and the politics surrounding those, and the like pro-war, anti-war factions that kind of, I guess, attach themselves to those fights, with the pro-war people being pro-Frazier and the anti-war people being pro-Ali, and also the backdrop of the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X. So interesting book, but the book's focus is more about the sports. Your focus needs to be a little bit more about the history. And the Linda Van Devanter Home Before Morning is exactly what it says it is. Army nurse in Vietnam. She's going to talk about how at first she's really gung-ho, go team, go USA. And then by the end, pretty quickly, her experiences in the war make her pretty jaded and then pretty broken. It's a rough book. It's a really rough book that talks about how her life changes and really kind of falls apart because of her involvement in the Vietnam conflict. Now, that's not everybody's story in Vietnam. That's really her personal story. And again, you don't have to choose any book from this list. You can choose something completely different. You just need to let me know ahead of time. Here's the rubric, how it's going to be graded, because people are like, how's it going to be graded? How am I supposed to know? Why I put the rubric in the syllabus, okay? So that's everything you need to know. Okay, there we go. Everything you could ever possibly want to know about your grade, all right? Okay, do you have any questions about grades or book review? Let me ask you a question. You ready? If you have a question about the grades or the book review, what could you do to find the answer? That is my question for this moment.
Check the syllabus.
Thank you. Check the syllabus, a really good idea. You could also ask someone else in the class, and what would someone else in the class tell you?
Check the syllabus.
That is correct. Yeah, that would be useful. It'd be good. Okay. You can email me and I'll probably tell you check the syllabus as well, but I will probably answer your question. Probably. I can't promise, but I probably will. All right. There you go. That's everything you need to know. All right. Sort of. That's everything you need to know about grades and the book review. All right. Notes. We had not finished the civil rights stuff from the 50s, so we're going to talk about that. And I don't know if I have weekly questions handy. Let me peek at the weekly questions. I don't remember. Sorry. Something about the civil rights movement, which is why we needed to go back over the stuff. Let me look here. That is definitely not it. That is definitely not it either. So sorry. I didn't really think about weekly questions because the other classes are done with them and I just didn't think about it. All right. Unit 3, weekly question. Civil rights movement gained momentum in the 50s, nearly 90 years after Reconstruction. Explain why the movement finally took off in the 50s, what caused it to do so. Be sure to think back to previous chapters. Okay, we will do that. All right, so I'll just kind of paste that in right here so you can look at it. I know you have access to it. All right, so, and I won't save it in there, but there it is. Civil rights movement gains momentum in the 50s, 90 years after Reconstruction. Why? So your answer to why has got to include some of the stuff that we're just about to talk about, but I would also talk about how World War II, Double V campaign, Truman desegregating the troops in 48, and Brown versus Board of Education in 54. So that's the first thing that we'll talk about today. And there are, there are several other things you could add in, but my assumption is that you will talk about Double V campaign, being in the military, hundreds of thousands of African Americans serving in the military in World War II, gaining experience outside of the United States, living in desegregated areas. And your book's really specific about instances where African Americans really stand up to the military because they're segregated in basic training. Talks really specifically about Jackie Robinson being that way in basic training in Texas at Fort Hood, and mentions a couple of other stories as well. Desegregation of the military happens by executive order in 1948, and that's Harry Truman. You could talk about the To Secure These Rights report that his administration adds. You could talk about civil rights being added to the Democratic Party platform in 1948. You have to talk about Brown versus Board of Education. So Brown versus Board of Education is a Supreme Court case in 1954 that reverses segregation in public schools. So you may or may not remember that there is a case in 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson. And this was about a guy wanting to ride on the whites-only train car, paid the same amount, got arrested in Louisiana, and decided he wanted to go to court because he wanted to set a precedent that if you paid the same amount for something, you got the same service. That was unsuccessful, and it caused the spread of segregation throughout the country. And the NAACP, led by Charles Hamilton Houston and then eventually Thurgood Marshall, will put several court cases in play and will try to desegregate different levels of education, starting with law school, then going to medical school, then to nursing school, then to all graduate schools, then to all colleges, and then the final step is public schools. This is a combination of 4 or 5 different cases. I think it's 4. I think there's one in Virginia, one South Carolina, one in Kansas, and one in somewhere else that I can't remember. Sorry. Maybe Alabama. Maybe it is Alabama. But the reason that they picked the Kansas case, they normally would do them in alphabetical order, but they picked the Kansas case so it doesn't look like it's just a Southern case. So they want it to look a little more diverse geographically, if that makes any sense. When this case starts, there is a Chief Justice named Fred Vinson who ends up passing away during the case, not like actually during the case. He dies at home, but not while he's on the bench. But he gets replaced by a fellow named Earl Warren. Earl Warren is appointed by Dwight Eisenhower because he helped run Eisenhower's campaign for re-election in California. Earl Warren's most recent job had been governor of California. He had not been a judge, he had been a lawyer. So he's going from governor of California to guy who ran Eisenhower's campaign in California to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, in the modern era, we would not be okay with that because he hadn't served as a judge on an appellate court or a district court, or honestly any court. But back in these days, as long as you weren't a criminal, if the president appointed you and you had reasonable qualifications, like Earl Warren had a law degree and had been a legislator, so he had some qualifications. He wasn't just some guy off the street or a U.S. history teacher from ACC or anything like that. He was legit. He just wasn't somebody we would accept now. So he ends up taking Fred Vinson's place. The court was pretty split under Vinson. It had already heard arguments. They had already done one round of discussion where they had a preliminary vote, which was 4 to reverse, 4 to keep, and 1 undecided. So when Earl Warren comes in, they have their discussion, and then at the end of their discussion, Earl Warren says, look, we cannot uphold this case and uphold Plessy versus Ferguson unless we're willing to say that blacks and whites are inherently unequal, and we can't do that. That's just not something we can do. So it's time to reverse this, but we need to do it in a way that will bring peace to the country. So we need to be as close to unanimous as possible. And he says, I'm not trying to force you into this. I want you to be convinced that it's legally viable. So he enlists the help of Felix Frankfurter, who was the ACLU lawyer that wrote that Sacco and Vanzetti should not have been executed. And he's a fairly conservative justice. He's the one who was undecided because he knew segregation was wrong. He just wasn't sure there was a good legal argument to reversing this. So he works on a legal argument because he's seen as the most scholarly member of the court. His legal argument is convincing. The other judges go with him, even the very, very Southern ones, to the point where the final decision is 9-0. The thought was if they had a 9-0 decision, it would be less controversial. They might be right. It was still fairly controversial, but this wasn't going to go over well in the South. They understood that. So Supreme Court desegregates public school in 1954. Most northern schools are already desegregated or on the path to that. So not a huge problem in the North. It's going to be a problem in the South. Other things you could mention that show either progress or not progress in the civil rights movement: Emmett Till's murder, which happens in 55, and Rosa Parks desegregating, not alone, of course, but helping with bus desegregation in Alabama, same year, 55. Now, I am assuming that you're familiar with Rosa Parks. She gets arrested because she wouldn't give up her seat to a white passenger. She asks the police officer, why is it that you do this? And he says, I don't know, but it's the law. But because she's highly respected in Montgomery, she's the secretary for the NAACP. She's an educated woman. She's a good reputation in the town, law-abiding, church-going, that sort of thing. There's a little more public sympathy for her than normally would be the case for an African American who resisted the law, potentially. It's why they picked her to do this. They didn't pick her, like they didn't say, like, hey, Mrs. Parks, don't give up your seat. But it's why they took her as the leader of the case. There were several other people who'd been arrested for this very thing, but they weren't as highly respected in the community. One of them was a high school dropout girl who had a couple of kids and had never been married and didn't have a job, and it's like, yeah, you don't look good for the cause. Because of the era they're in, it really mattered who the person was that had been discriminated against. So they needed to pick a really good, clean person with no scandal to be discriminated against, so that the case wouldn't be about, oh, well, that girl's, she's sleazy, or that guy's a thug, or that sort of thing. This way, it's just about what happened to the person who was a very good person. With Rosa Parks, they also needed to pick a spokesperson for this movement, and because it's the South, and typically the most educated person in the community is either going to be a teacher or the preacher. They needed a preacher. Also helpful to have a preacher because that way you can also use the church for meetings, and you need a big place for the meetings. and you can't use a public place because they're segregated. So the preacher that they asked to help with this was Martin Luther King Jr., whom I know you're all familiar with. And 19, whatever year this was, 55, I know what year it was, in 1955, he was 25 years old. So he had just graduated from college. He's clearly a very good speaker, even at age 25. He's a very intellectual fellow, highly educated, good writer, good speaker. Just finished his doctorate in divinity. So, you know, that's an unusual thing. Most people didn't even go to college back then, and he had finished graduate school. But one of the main reasons that they pick him is he'd never been arrested before. And if you're wondering, like, did they really have trouble finding preachers that hadn't been arrested before? Yeah, if they're involved in the civil rights movement, because they would get arrested for leading a demonstration, disturbing the peace, that sort of thing. So Martin Luther King Jr. is a clean, shiny dude. Also Rosa Parks, a clean, shiny woman. And of course, that means everyone will leave them alone, or people will try to firebomb Rosa Parks' house after she does this. The bus boycott lasts for over a year. It's primarily organized by African-American women. At least the transportation arrangements are made. So the people who aren't riding the buses need a way to work. So not everybody has a car, otherwise they wouldn't be riding the bus. So they organize carpool groups. And those are primarily organized by college professor African-American women at historically Black colleges because they have access to copiers. So a lot of the footwork of the civil rights movement, especially in the South, is done by educated Black women. It's pretty common. And the spokespeople are educated Black men as a rule. And that's kind of a sign of the 50s as well. What else do we want to say about? Probably nothing else about Rosa Parks, but the boycott lasts for a long time, over a year. The company's about to go bankrupt. And the reason that they desegregate the bus lines is not because they're about to go bankrupt. They've said they'd rather go bankrupt than desegregate, and they were pretty close. They desegregate because federal courts say they have to. So they end up getting a court ruling that says that they have to. Also, I didn't mention Emmett Till. I mean, it's listed there. And there's a link on there if you want to watch a video or find some more information about Emmett Till. But Emmett Till's a little dude who lives in Chicago with his mom. His dad's in the military overseas. His mom works in an office, has a decent job, but you know, school's out or son didn't have anything to do. She's from Mississippi. She says, hey son, I think I'm gonna send you down to hang with the relatives in Mississippi for the summer. He goes, that's cool, it'll give me something to do. And then she gives him the mom talk that, you know, moms give to their kids before they send them somewhere they don't live to stay with the relatives for a month. They say, look, you gotta behave, you gotta represent me well, you gotta make sure you don't misbehave. She also tells him, look, you've grown up in Chicago, you go to an integrated school. Mississippi is not the same. So when you go to Mississippi, you don't talk to white people, you don't look at white people, you don't joke around about white people, you stay away from white people. Now, Emmett thought his mom was just out of touch, like, oh, she's behind the times, she doesn't know that everybody's getting along better now, there's not nearly as much danger. So he goes to the South to hang with his cousins. He's got his yearbook. He tells everybody that the white girls in the picture are his girlfriends. You know, he talks about how the North is different than the South. And so his cousins dare him to go into a store and say something to a white woman. Now, nobody's completely sure what he said because there's several different stories. Some people said he whistled at her. Some people said he said, bye, baby. Some people said he just smiled at her and said hello. Whatever it was, Black men or Black teens, he's 14, were not supposed to address white women in any way. So he did. And he's also, I didn't mention, he's kind of a big kid. He's like 6 feet tall. But he also has a little baby face, so it's really clear that he's a little kid. He really is. But anyway, and plus, you know, there's a difference in how people act at different ages. So He goes in, says, bye, baby, or whatever he says. Later that night, her husband and brother-in-law go to the relative's house where Emmett is staying. They take him out, they beat him, torture him, kill him, tie him to a cotton gin fan, and throw him in the river. When they find his body 3 days later, it's unrecognizable. The only way they were fairly sure it was him is he was wearing a ring that his mom had given him that had his initials in it. So they end up charging a couple people with murder, but they get tried by an all-white jury in the neighborhood, and it's a local trial, and they get found not guilty. And then the two guys that killed him tell their story to some journalists and make about a year's pay for the story that they sell about how they killed the guy that they got found not guilty for killing. And they say in the story, the reason that they killed him is that he said he had white girlfriends and that they needed to prevent miscegenation or mixing of the races. But that's a year after Brown versus Board of Education, which kind of gives you an idea why desegregation doesn't go quite as quickly in the South as it does in the North. And I am not suggesting to you that there weren't racist people in the North. I feel confident that there were, or in the Midwest, or any part of the world, not just the United States, of course, but that the predominant political group in charge was probably more racist in the South than they were in the North. I feel confident saying that. Okay. Other stuff that happened, civil rights related, when Eisenhower becomes president, Eisenhower was not super excited that the military was being desegregated. He was in charge of the US forces in NATO when Truman desegregated the military, and he wasn't in favor of it. However, because he's in the military, you follow orders. So he did. Excuse me. So now he's president. He gets elected in 52. Yeah. And you got Brown versus Board of Education. Now, later on, Eisenhower would say that the biggest mistake he made as president was appointing Earl Warren to the Supreme Court, which kind of tells you how he felt about Earl Warren and desegregation. And Warren is going to do some other things that aren't nearly as conservative as Eisenhower was, because sometimes you get surprises. However, 1957, the NAACP recruits 9 African-American kids in Little Rock, Arkansas, to attend the public high school there, Little Rock Central, to force desegregation of this public high school. They are met by the Arkansas National Guard their first day, who at bayonet point tell them that they are not welcome in the school. So, and one of the girls, I can't remember if it was Melba Patillo, or I can't remember which girl got separated, but there were crowds, shouting that they wanted to lynch her and that she needed to be killed. And, maybe the only super good part of the story that day was, she's trying to get home. She goes to the city bus and she waits at the bus stop where people surround her and are yelling and, threatening her. So a lady who lives nearby sees this happening. She walks out. She's an old gal. She's clearly, late 60s, early 70s. She's an old looking gal. And she goes over and runs all those kids off, and she takes that girl and they get on the bus and she rides home with her and makes sure she's safe. And she's an old white grandma, but grandmas don't like it when you pick on kids. So way to go, grandma. But Eisenhower's got a problem now. He's not super in favor of desegregation. However, he is very much in favor of law and order, and he can't have the governor of some puny little state, Arkansas, telling him whether or not they're going to obey court rulings and whether or not they're going to be in your face like this. So he sends the 101st Airborne to Little Rock Central, where they force the desegregation of the school. He's also going to assign 9 paratroopers to save for the entire first semester, 1 for each African-American kid. So those kids are pretty well left alone because they've all got their own paratrooper that goes with them everywhere at school except the bathroom. Now, second semester, the paratroopers are gone and things don't go quite as well. But 8 of them make it through the school year. 1 retaliated against some harassment and then they kicked her out of school. Ernest Green's the one who graduates. And then what the state of Arkansas decides is they know that being kind of in your face, bringing in the Arkansas National Guard is not a good strategy. It's too aggressive, and the federal government's going to fight back about that. What they do instead is they decide to cancel public school. So they just cancel all public high school for a couple of years, and they give all the kids a voucher. And they say, look, you take this voucher and you go wherever you want to school. You can pick a private school. All the public schools close. There's no ruling yet that says private schools can't discriminate. So all of the private schools in Arkansas are segregated. So what primarily happens is there are no public schools, black or white, and then black kids don't really have a place to go to school. So it's also why if you hear people who get upset about school vouchers, this is why, because it goes back to a time where school vouchers were used purposely to discriminate against certain kids. So the South does follow a policy of massive resistance to the Eisenhower administration and then to future administrations where they try to find ways to fight back against desegregation. If you're wondering how successful they are, they're fairly successful. The reason I say this is because some of you have probably seen that movie, Remember the Titans, which is based on a true story. And you know, you like that movie because it has good music. That's why you like that movie. Now, it's based on a true story, mostly true story, but the setting is real. In 1970, 71, they're trying to desegregate a high school in Virginia. And I did say 1970 and 71 school year. So Brown versus Board of Education is 1954. Remember the Titans is 1970, 71. Where they're still fighting to desegregate a school. And I was born in the mid-60s and went to elementary school in the early 70s. They were still doing that throughout the entire 1970s. So this massive resistance, they did slow down integration quite a bit. There's no way around that. That's just true. I'm going to delete this so it all fits up here nicely, maybe. Oh, that didn't work, did it? I hope I didn't delete anything important. Okay. And then the 1960 election, I know that we've talked about this before, so I'll keep it short. Nixon versus Kennedy. Probably Kennedy wins because of the televised debate where he looks better. If you listened to it, you thought Nixon won. If you watched it, you thought Kennedy won. Most 2/3 of the people watched it, 1/3 listened. Kennedy wins by the smallest margin in history to that point, less than 1%. Kennedy's a legit Purple Heart guy, but also not as much political experience. He's kind of young, but he's not super young. He's 42. Nixon's a little older, but I don't think he's quite 50. I think he's in his 40s as well. Kennedy's from a wealthy family, elite background, had gone to Harvard and then Georgetown. Nixon was much more middle class, Whittier College in California and Duke Law School scholarship. So, but he'd also been vice president, he'd been in Congress longer, he'd been the head of the House Un-American Activities Committee. So Nixon had more political experience. Kennedy was, I don't know, more fun, better looking, cute wife. Not that Mrs. Nixon was unattractive. She was a lovely woman, I'm quite sure. But the Kennedy family, you know, had some appeal that the Nixon family didn't quite as much. Although again, Nixon, cute wife, cute kids, no doubt. But, you know, Jackie Kennedy looked like a model and spoke French. That was kind of fun. And John Kennedy, you know, looked like a model and spoke English and was a war hero. So they just looked great, had little kids that just, we called it Camelot. You know, we said that was kind of our new beginning, and it was like our royalty, which we didn't get to have, you know, because it's the US. All right, I'm going to stop for a second to see if you have any questions, and then we'll need to proceed just a little bit. I know we don't have a lot of time, but we are, you know, kind of behind. All right. Why did the civil rights movement take so long to finally be established? Well, I would say the federal government had very little interest in enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment saying that you could not discriminate against people based on race, and the 15th Amendment saying essentially that Black men could vote. You notice that the southern states were able to add all sorts of voting restrictions, literacy tests, the poll tax, and they also didn't protect voters against the KKK after, you know, after Reconstruction. So when the Republican Party in particular loses their desire to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, and they say that that's the state's job, the southern states go like, okay, we'll do it, but they're the southern states, they're not going to. And they feel like, the leadership in those states feels like that they just want to restore things to the way they were as much as possible before the Civil War. If the federal government's not going to step in, that's part of why I talked about the Emmett Till case, because here you have a kid murdered. It's very clear that he got murdered, and the local authorities are like, yeah, he killed a Black kid because he smarted off to a white woman. Of course they did. He deserved it. And there's no federal government that comes in and says, what? You can't do that. And there's no appeal to that decision that's going to make any difference. Well, and you saw what happened in Arkansas. You know, if you're going to be in your face, like, no, we are not going to desegregate and bring in the National Guard, the Arkansas National Guard, then yeah, they're going to bring in the 101st Airborne. But if you just say, like, you know what, we'll just kind of quietly cancel public school. So I guess the short answer there is the federal government doesn't have any interest in enforcing either the 14th or 15th Amendment, or even for quite a while, Brown versus Board of Education. And of course, you've got that court ruling, Plessy versus Ferguson, that says separate but equal is fine. And that gives a legal foundation for segregation. So it causes segregation to spread throughout the country. So you have legal reasons, you have cultural reasons, and I think the big reason that you see things change, and I know I've talked about this a lot, but the big reason you see things change is because a lot of African Americans fight in World War II. So they get the training that you get as a soldier, they get the confidence that you get from being that fit and that much of a leader, and from going overseas and defeating Nazis. And so when you go back home and somebody says you can't use this water fountain, you can't do this, you can't do that, they go like, heck, we defeated Hitler, we're pretty sure we can use whatever water fountain we want. So, I mean, that's not directly what they say, but they take action. And almost all of these court cases, Brown, I think Oliver Brown was a World War II veteran. I would have to double check. But I know that James Meredith was a military veteran. I know that Heman Sweat, the guy who integrated UT Law School, was a veteran as well. And you see a lot of veterans really getting involved in these cases because they're just not putting up with this anymore. So maybe that was a longer answer than you wanted, but what a huge bonus for you, right? Do you guys have any other questions, or are you scared now? Like, no, I don't want to ask anything else. She'll talk too long, probably. All right, we have like 5 minutes. It's enough, right? So your weekly question for this week, I'm sorry, I'm looking for the little share screen button. There we go, so sorry. Your weekly question for this week is, during the 60s, the US become more open, tolerant, freer country, yes or no? So, and you know, when you get a question like this in a history class, probably in life as well, the answer is typically yes and no. So that's going to be the case for this. You'll want to talk about parts of the civil rights movement that clearly expand people's rights, but you'll also want to talk about things that clearly did not expand people's rights or that, you know, caused people problems. So we'll talk about that just a teeny weeny bit for a couple of minutes, and then we'll talk about that quite a bit more next time. And then the 60s is really the biggest part of the civil rights movement. I'll just kind of go through this part super quickly, and then we'll hit Kennedy and foreign policy and what leads to Vietnam and how that maybe helps restrict people's rights a little bit. So civil rights movement, emphasis on nonviolence, public awareness, which is why Dr. King, Southern Christian Leadership Conference emphasized nonviolent resistance based on Gandhi, Reinhold Niebuhr, who's a German theologian that MLK liked quite a bit and wrote his thesis about. And then Bayard Rustin, who we talked about before, was the guy who led the seminars on peaceful nonviolent resistance, who was also openly gay. So he couldn't be, you know, a public part of the civil rights movement. Now the students, the college kids get a little impatient because they think this is taking too long. So they want to press the issue. They don't want to become violent. They want to, you know, be more vocal and more upfront. So they're going to do lunch counter sit-ins where they go to these small diner kind of restaurants and sit down and order food in places that are segregated to the point where people come in and beat them up, and then they get arrested after they get beaten up because they disturbed the peace. Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, arranges freedom rides, which is primarily college kids who ride and integrate interstate buses from the north to the south. And those buses typically get stopped, and protesters will beat up the bus riders. Sometimes they set the buses on fire. Sometimes the KKK attacks them. So these guys are in danger and get beaten, sometimes shot at. And Dr. King is going to lead voting rights marches, and one of the most notable ones in Birmingham leads to his arrest. Now, the local pastors will write an editorial where they complain that he's come to their town and caused all this unrest, and if he really were a man of peace, he would stay home. And his response is that letter from the Birmingham jail, which would be worth reading if you have time, where he talks about, you know, from my perspective, not doing anything is the problem. You know, if you're called the things we're called and treated the way we're treated, you wouldn't say it's okay to stay home. It's time to fix stuff. And this video, I've put the link in here again, A Time for Justice, really good depiction of all of the early parts of the civil rights movement. Really worth your time again if you have 30 minutes to spare. And the March on Washington culminates with the I Have a Dream speech, which we're all fairly familiar with, I think. And it's really considered probably the high point of the early part of the movement, and it leads directly to Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, you know, very quickly thereafter in 64 and 65. I would also mention to you, as we have to wrap things up, that the March on Washington was also organized by Bayard Rustin, who's going to be in the background, but still a super important part of the civil rights movement. All right, do not log out yet because I just want to double check on the attendance. Here are people I don't think are here. Christian Cockrell. Oh, I should probably stop recording.